Hi. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm really excited to present this session, Through the Looking Glass, Reducing Information Asymmetry Through Availability of Project-Level Data on Impact Bonds. Quite a mouthful. I'm really pleased to introduce a great panel for the discussion this afternoon. To my left is Pettenkofer, who is Senior Executive at Munich Re, and he leads the company's investment into impact bonds. Then we have Ziswiler, who is Head of Social Impact Finance at UBS Optimus Foundation. Then Josh Pritchard from Reform, a think tank based in the UK, who has focused on some work around commissioning and the delivery of public services. And then Maitland Hudson joins us from the social investment business, where she's Director of Learning and Influence. I wanted to say a little preface before we get into this one. In part because I feel a bit naive. I think I often feel naive at these conferences because despite researching impact bonds and payment by results approaches since about 2012, every time I get close to thinking that I understand these things, I hear another presentation. Someone else challenges my assumptions of the way that I think about these things, and I think that's been particularly the case at this conference. Secondly, I feel slightly naive for agreeing to chair a session on data and information with a commitment to Andrea to make it exciting. But just because I get thrills from data doesn't mean that it's automatically exhilarating for everyone else, but I have promises from the panel to keep things energized. And thirdly, I feel a little bit naive in terms of my views around data and information on impact bonds and how to potentially frame this panel. And I want to say a little bit about our journey as a team at the Go Lab around data and information in this space. Back in 2017, we were asked by senior government officials in the Cabinet Office and in Treasury for an evidence review of impact bonds. This seemed pretty reasonable. They've been experimenting with these things for the best part of a decade at that point, and they were asking, how are SIBs being used? Are they working? Do they work? They wanted evidence on performance. They wanted to demonstrate the benefits, think about the types of organisations involved and how they'd fared over time. They wanted to know whether the benefits outweighed the costs. They had concerns about transaction costs and whether that had changed over time, their interest in returns. And we really struggled. It was pretty tough. There wasn't a sufficiently detailed set of information available in the public domain, and so we really struggled to answer that question. Information held by different government departments wasn't really shared or across different councils. And so we did what we could with the public information available, but ultimately we were really reliant on informal insights from the market players, from the leading intermediaries and the fund managers in that space. And we're really grateful to them for helping us out and enabling us to start to answer some of those questions. So initially, I wanted to frame this session as a moonshot. Like, come on, guys, you're the market, you're the ecosystem of impact bonds. Can you just help me get the data set together to answer these questions, please? But then I realised that was navel-gazing. I was also being a bit selfish, thinking that everyone else was just interested in helping me build a database to answer quite a narrow set of questions. And then I started speaking more to other people in this space who are also having challenging conversations around data and information on impact bonds. Other people were struggling with access. Different people had different sets of questions. But it seemed to be quite an uneven playing field out there in terms of who had sight of what. Different perspectives on what might be more or less helpful to inform decision-making. And also, due to the complex structure of these things, their multi-party nature, who owns or has the right to share data is quite slippery, and that's quite tricky. And so Nigel came up with a title for the session that was a little bit more cryptic. Through the Looking Glass, for those who aren't so familiar with Lewis Carroll's children's stories, it's a story about Alice in an unfamiliar and very different world where things are not quite as they seem and are quite unexpected. So I think that reflects some people's experiences of information around impact bonds. And for me, it also conjures a view of mirrors. And perhaps a hall of mirrors is most appropriate, because depending on the information that you have sight of, these things might look quite different. They might be stretched and distorted in different ways, and that's always going to be quite partial depending on what we have sight of. So we thought it would be helpful to come together and talk through some different perspectives, begin to unpick some of the issues around information on impact bonds. So it's on that note that I'd like to invite Christian to give us a little bit of an insight into his role and how you became initially involved and interested in the impact bond approach.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Eleanor. Thank you for inviting me. It's a really great event and very thought-provoking. So you said you started looking at impact bonds in 2012. We did start that in 2017, so our experience is limited. We invest in impact bonds is not really true, because we've invested only once so far, unfortunately, I have to say. We've invested in the humanitarian impact bond of the ICRC. And data is a key element of that, and I like the title very much, and I can elaborate on that. We love data. We think data is a very exciting thing. If you come to Munich, to our beer festival, we will sit there, drink a beer, and discuss data only. Yeah? What can be more thrilling than that? So I'm from Munich Re. Munich Re is an insurance and reinsurance group. So reinsurance means we insure insurance companies. What we have in terms of assets, it's fourfold. It's first of all the people and their know-how and their talent. Secondly, not least important, the reputation. Thirdly, our capital. And the fourth point, and it becomes more and more important, is data. The data we collect, the data we analyze, the data we enrich. And we need data for our decision making. Whenever we provide insurance cover, this is based on a process which we call the so-called underwriting process. And it is based on information and data which we model. And I mean, typical examples for our business are that we, for example, reinsure catastrophes. So whenever a hurricane is occurring and there is danger that it hits Florida, we are insuring that scenario. For that, we need data in order to come up with terms and conditions and a price. And data which goes back a long period of time, historic data, so that we can see how often does that happen in terms of frequency. Which damage does it cause in terms of severity? And that sounds simple compared with impact bonds if there wouldn't be climate change. And also other situations, like we are insuring cars, for example. That is even more complicated, because if you insure cars, you need a lot of information in order to come up with a price and with terms and conditions. And there are so many elements which play a role. Which car, which driver, where is the location? Even the color of the car can play a decisive role in order to assess the risk which you're insuring. What do you think is the most risky color of a car, Maya?
Red.
Red, yeah. Red is good. And what is the... Okay, yeah. And what is the least risky color of a car? Orange, yeah? Based on statistics, it's orange. And so, when it comes... Now go ahead and buy an orange car. Yeah? when it comes to impact bonds, and that's what we do for a very limited period, and we would love to do more, we view that also as kind of an insurance cover, because if you look at an impact bond, the success of the interventions is subject to risks. And if we are able to evaluate these risks, we could insure them in theory. If we are able to evaluate them, if we can insure them, then we can also invest. And if we look at the humanitarian impact bond, for example, then this impact bond is subject to many risks. So it's about building rehabilitation centers in Africa. And it's subject to risks which are in connection with the construction, with the operation of that rehab centers. It's in connection with default risk, that one of the subcontractors or even the ICRC defaults becomes insolvent. There can be political risks, that the new mayor of that town, the rehab center is supposed to be built, all of a sudden disapproves it. It can be subject to various risks, which we assess and we model. And maybe coming back to yesterday evening's session, we think of that as a very complex thing. Yeah? Nevertheless, we think we are able to model it. And that's why we also think that our capabilities, our know-how can be transferred to the impact bond world. That's why we are interested in investing in it.
Great. Thank you, Christian. Maya, perhaps I could pass to you to give us a sense of your interesting role that sort of spans the foundation world and the investment world.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So UBS Optimus Foundation was created about 20 years ago with the objective of helping UBS clients have an impact with their philanthropy, of improve the impact of their philanthropy. We see ourselves as trying to bring in new and better money to the social and development sector. We give out both grants as well as social investments. We really come at it from three different angles, basically. One, we look at how we can build the ecosystem, and what we mean by that is building evidence, building capacity, as well as sharing knowledge. The second thing is, as a foundation that's linked to a large financial institution, we see our role as trying to test new models and new approaches that can link financial and returns and social returns. So while impact bonds is one model that we've looked at, we're also looking at other impact-linked financed opportunities. And then thirdly, how can we take some of the results of these pilots, the ones that have worked, and transition them to scale, either through UBS, which is the natural partner, but also looking at other partners, whether it be government or bilateral donors. So we really came to the impact bond as, let's explore whether this tool really has the potential to link financial and social returns. Can it be a better way to deploy philanthropic funding? And how can we help build the ecosystem and build the market? And so back to the title around data and information, I think critical to us was, how can we make sure that in everything we do, we document our learnings, so we accompany everything with process evaluations, and we share knowledge with as many people as possible.
Great, thanks, Maya. And Josh, your think tank is known for probably looking at larger programs and scrutinising public value across far bigger portfolios than impact bonds. What hooked you into looking at this stuff?
Well, I think that's completely right. I mean, Reform, so we're a public services think tank, so we look at everything essentially to do with public services. I mean, last year the government spent about £810 billion in total. So the social impact bond sort of field is obviously much smaller. However, you know, the sort of key things we look for is, you know, how do you ensure that public services are the highest possible quality they can be? And also, how do you ensure that they're being delivered at value for money? So, you know, when we started working on a project about a year ago now, which sort of resulted in a procurement report in March, everyone kept talking about outcomes-based commissioning, payment by results, and inevitably social impact bonds kept coming up. So, you know, obviously there's a very interesting dynamic within an impact bond. You know, you've got this mixture of, as one of the sessions earlier today talked about, the sort of public-private relationship. You've got the very vulnerable cohorts of society who you're targeting. You've got the, you know, discussions around innovation and then scalability. So from our perspective, we're looking at this, you know, this is another tool in a commissioner's toolkit, but we're not quite sure whether it works or not. And as a think tank, you know, we don't have access to central government information unless it's in the public domain. We don't have access to the private, you know, the stakeholders who are involved with an impact bond. We don't have access to that information unless it's in the public domain. So we have to rely upon, first and foremost, what is out there to be able to evaluate these models, these mechanisms effectively. And secondly, we have to be able to know who to approach to try and find that information if we want to get it. So when we started working on this project, when we started digging deeper into social impact bonds, the first sort of challenge we came across was there really is a distinct lack of consistency as to what information is out there on a project by project level. And that's to be expected given the sort of the wide range of different stakeholders involved, and also the sort of policy areas which impact bonds have been used in. But it's still frustrating from my perspective, because of course I want to see this information and I want to know what's going on, and I want to be able to say to a commissioner or an MP or a civil servant, I want to be able to say, this is where social impact bonds could be used. This is where they've been used, from the past. And I've got no horse in this race. I'm not involved in any way. So from an outside perspective, this is what I think. And it proved challenging. I've spoke to Al before about this. It really has been an uphill struggle at times. And we've been very fortunate that we've begun recently interviewing a wide range of people who've been involved. Not just commissioners or investors, but the providers themselves, to talk about this issue, amongst others. And really, the sort of tantalizing thing about this is that impact bonds have a lot of potential in different ways, but how do you sell that to a commissioner without sounding as if you're, going to get a payoff from this? So it's been an interesting struggle. Our big thing is we just want to make sure that if taxpayers' money is being spent, how's it being spent, and is it being spent effectively? And most importantly, are citizens benefiting from this service? So I guess that's our kind of perspective, I guess.
Thanks. And over to you, Jen. You've had some interesting roles in the voluntary sector and in different kinds of information use. We've been talking a lot about outcomes-oriented approaches, so it'd be great to get your take on the use of outcomes data.
Yes, I can. I guess it's sort of going down the table. We're getting from big data to really very, very small data down here. So the kind of data I can talk about. So I can talk about information asymmetry and the availability of project level data. It's just that availability is extremely patchy and often very poor. So my experience is much more in wider social investment and grant making, less than social impact bonds specifically. What I have spent a lot of time doing is picking my way through a lot of project level data, from relatively small organisations to larger ones who are delivering social programmes, who have received social investment. And the quality of that data is almost universally poor, partly because we have a bad system for collecting it. So for intermediaries, there's often it's quite an extractive system. The intention is that we want to, as intermediaries, we want to know whether or not the money that we've spent has achieved its targets. We want to be able to say whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, and influence government or whoever else. But we're not necessarily thinking about the people collecting the data on the front line, what it's like for them. Is it useful for them to do this data collection? So it's not actually often a very helpful game for the different participants within it. So I have spent a lot of time trying to think about how we could improve that system and think differently about the data that we collect to reduce information asymmetry, but to also ensure that project level data goes back to frontline organisations. So it always serves a dual purpose. It's not just for us to be able to say this did good. We're able to prove to our investors or everyone else that it achieved what it set out to, but that data actually informs the frontline work and is useful for that. And there are, I think, probably one way of talking about that is to give a specific example. So I think there's a lack of diversification in the information that we use in social investment. There is this emphasis on beneficiary level data, and if you're going to talk about collection of beneficiary level data, that is typically reliant on frontline organisations asking their beneficiaries for information and them just passing it back up the chain, and that has built-in unreliability at almost every level. What is often very much lacking from that whole system is an effective use of other kinds of data sources. So you were saying you don't have access to private data. There's open data in government administrative sources, but often frontline organisations are poorly placed to exploit that. There is also all of this private data out there, proprietary data, that the social sector doesn't access and isn't able to use. So it can't do the kind of analysis of the orange car versus the red car. And that is something that is a very clear information asymmetry, and it makes the ability to work effectively by frontline organisations that much more difficult. So to give one example of something I've worked on over the last couple of years, there's an increasing interest. Again, these things are cyclical, but place-based working has come back in and is another popular again, as it has been in the past. And lots of trusts, foundations, social investors have become more interested in place-based investment and how to go about doing that effectively. And the amount of information that's out there in order to be able to make a good place-based investment is thin on the ground. Typically. So I worked with a marketing agency to use their data exhaust to look at local economies and to be able to give a little bit of a view of the assets of a local place, as well as the deficits that you get from the indices of multiple deprivation. And that data was banking data, it's RBS banking data, and you can look at credit and debit card payments. You can also look at standing orders and sort of every sort of part of someone's individual banking information, which is scary, but also in the aggregate. So we can't go down and look at individuals. But what it does allow us to do is to differentiate between two places, say two comparative places that are at the same level in the IMD, both highly deprived, but actually have very different local economies. So the most kind of the clearest example was a postcode in Grimsby versus a postcode in Luton, which on the IMD were very evenly matched. But their economies were completely different. So Luton had a very vibrant local economy, particularly retail-facing economy, with 90-plus businesses in the postcode, and Grimsby had 3. And they were all petrol stations. So in that case, you're talking about two really very, very different economies. If you're thinking then about how, as an investor, you can invest in those places, you would look very differently at your investment model. So in the case of Luton, you've got assets there to build on. You've got a local economy, you've got a mixed population, you've got potential available money and local capital. In Grimsby, there was none of that. So the need for institutional investment is higher. There's probably a longer-term commitment to reviving that economy. That is exactly the kind of information asymmetry I think is really important, and that we could, as intermediaries, we could do so much more to diversify the ways that we collect data and to ensure that that data is then fed back down the chain, not only to inform our own decisions, but to ensure that the organisations delivering social programmes have access to that information themselves, can start asking more informed questions, can link that data to their own on-the-ground data, which is much harder for us as intermediaries to access, but so that you have different points of view. And those are the sorts of data loops that I think we're lacking. I think that they should be part of what we talk about when we talk about this kind of commissioning. And we could do a lot more. I get very excited about this. But there is a lot of opportunity here, and there's too little work being done on it at the moment, in my view.
Great, thanks, Jen. So just rolling with this theme of information asymmetry, there you were talking about the asymmetries and imbalance between private data being accessible to the social sector. I, in the past, have been very concerned about the asymmetry between investor and public sector commissioner. And Christian, on our call before this session, you talked about potential asymmetries actually between the provider and the potential investors in these things. So it'd be great to get your sense of any other problematic information asymmetries that you see here.
Yeah, so from our limited point of view, information asymmetry is not the main problem, but the problem lies with availability of data, as you already mentioned here. So with regard to the humanitarian impact bond, for example, we had a lot of data to rely on, and that was shared with all stakeholders. So there was kind of a level playing field for the decisions to be made. Yeah, so they already operated 163 rehabilitation centers in the past over the last 40 years, and we were able to build on that data. What they are not familiar with is how to use that raw data and how to structure it in a way an investor would need it. And I'm not entirely sure how, for example, DFID, on which basis DFID makes its decisions, but I think it's rather similar. So they also need data. They also need evidence for the intervention to be successful. And they also need evidence that failures which have been made are transferred in lessons learned and that there are improvements. So from our limited experience with regard to information asymmetry, well, I don't really can confirm that so far.
Okay, that's interesting. Maya, how does that chime with your experience?
So maybe I can add to information asymmetry, information access, and understanding of the information, because I think that's a key issue that I think we're facing, is that the different stakeholders in an impact bond have very different levels of understanding of the information that is being provided. So maybe I'll think about it from the different stakeholders' point of view on the one hand, and then from the different phases of the impact bond, so the design phase on the one hand, and then the implementation phase on the other. So if I think about the design phase, in an ideal world, you would want everybody to have access to the same information. Fantastic that in your case that was true. In our experience, that's absolutely not the case. I think that critical in that design phase is, from an investor's point of view, getting all the information that it needs in order to price that risk. And Christian alluded to some of the things that Munich Re does in terms of how do you price that risk. I think from a commercial investor's perspective, the key piece that is a little bit difficult to price is the implementation risk, because that's an area that they're not very familiar with. So how do you, the selection of the service providers, how do you assess whether the service provider actually has the ability to deliver on the impact? I think certainly from a foundation's perspective, maybe we're more familiar with that. From a commercial investor perspective, and it's been our experience in reaching out to commercial investors to invest in impact bonds, that piece is it's a black box, because they don't feel comfortable really thinking about that. So that's, I would say, one thing. The other thing on the implementation side is the implementers need to get comfortable with the targets that are being set and how comfortable they are that they understand the evaluation methodology that they're going to be that is being used to reach those targets. And I'll give an example of a quality education DIB that we were involved in as an investor, and there it's a DIB that aims to improve learning gains for 200,000 children in Gujarat, Delhi, and Uttar Pradesh. And the methodology that is being used is an item response theory questionnaire to measure children's abilities and attitudes. While that may be the best way to measure learning gains, how do you translate that to what the implementer on the ground actually needs to do in order to meet that those targets that are being set? So that translation between the best method to actually tangibly on the ground, what is it that I actually need to do, is I think an issue. And then if I move on to the implementation piece, I think there's an asymmetry between the level of, let's say, live performance management data that is being collected by the performance manager and the service providers, and how that is then shared with others such as outcome funders. So there's definitely much more data that is available on the ground for that day-to-day management, and the outcome funder doesn't necessarily have access to that data. Finally, I think even if we all agreed up front on the evaluation methodology, then making sure that that methodology is actually being implemented in a way that the data that is there actually matches the original intention. Again, I'll give a quick example. We are an investor in an impact bond that aims to improve maternal and newborn health. And the way that we're measuring whether they're improving maternal and newborn health is around quality standards in small rural hospitals. One of the ways that those quality standards are looked at is observing live childbirth. So you actually look at what happens, and you see, are they following the right procedures? Are the instruments being sterilized? Are they looking at the right signals that maybe would trigger a C-section? In case of no live birth, the evaluator decided they would go ahead and just ask the question to the medical staff, the nurses, the midwives, and the doctors. What do you do? What is the process that you follow? Well, the medical staff in rural Rajasthan will not be able to tell you off the top of their head the 7 steps in the right order. So the evaluator failed those facilities, which means that doesn't then trigger payment. So what we went back to do and said, well, actually, maybe an alternative is that you use mannequins so that you actually you observe the way that they actually do it, and they're able to do it. But because the intended use of the methodology was not being implemented properly, it created an issue that, if it hadn't been fixed, would actually have caused the impact bond to fail completely. I'll stop there.
Can I add 2 points to that? First of all, I think absolutely correct, the live performance data to be collected. Many of the service providers are unfamiliar with the level and the granularity which we require for monitoring that. So just to add to that, with regard to the implementation risk, I would not entirely agree, because if you're not able to assess the capability of the service provider and its track record, then you are not able to invest. Yeah.
But you're one of the only commercial investors that invests in impact bonds.
Yeah, so far, yeah. But if we are not able to assess that risk, we are not able to invest. So we feel rather comfortable.
You're an exception.
And I think that's an interesting point. Was there anything culturally? You mentioned that there was a lot of information sharing across all of the parties in the deal that you were involved in. Was there anything culturally that you felt was an important facilitator to that degree of information sharing that maybe hasn't been seen elsewhere?
Culturally, I mean, certainly we in our company, we are not only data nerds, but we are also reporting nerds. Yeah, and so and we love Excel spreadsheets, and we know how to fill them, and we have to fill them for various reasons. Yeah, for accounting reasons, for other reporting reasons. Even the rating agencies want a different type of reporting, and that's not the Red Cross. So the Red Cross does not usually fulfill these standards. So there was kind of I wouldn't call it cultural, but in terms of reporting standards, yeah, there was a huge difference. And they sort of had to adapt our approach because they need to monitor that. And I think they, in a way, like it also because it provides even better transparency for the success of their interventions. Yeah.
Okay,
So
Jen,
like
I saw your eyebrows go up on that
Right,
one.
I mean, yes, that providers like someone's spreadsheet is unusual, I think.
They like the results out of the spreadsheet, because it provides them with more transparency. Yeah, that's.
I mean, that's good.
Maybe
That's
they
really
just
good.
tell me, you know.
So I suppose that's one of the, you've got information asymmetries, you've also got power asymmetries. When you've got an investor providing money and to an organisation that otherwise would not be able to do the particular piece of work, it becomes very difficult to push back and say, actually, we don't want to measure in this particular kind of way. And I've had experience of that on both sides. So I founded and ran a charity. I've worked in the front line. I have been in charge of doing the measurement for certain sorts of grants. And it is, and I'm, I have an academic background. I had a PhD when I was doing these things. I was in a much stronger position than most people to be able to push back when I was asked to undertake certain sorts of measurements that I didn't think were appropriate. I don't think most people are in my position, and even in my position, I still found it quite hard to say some of this I don't want to collect, or I don't want to collect in this way. So I think it's understanding the different links in that chain and what it is like to collect that data. And then we can point to public sector experiences of this, where the level of gaming that becomes involved in those loops in that chain are pretty clear. It really only takes testing the data a little bit to see that it's not accurate, and that it brings about sort of different ways of delivering the work than the ones that are ideal. So Maya's example of the hospital is that kind of thing happens, and there you had the data being collected by an independent party. So that's a different thing. Often you're marking your own homework, so you're the person who's collecting the information and inputting it in the spreadsheet, and you want the payment. So you're incentivized to ensure that you're inputting the data that people want to see. And those kinds of they come with the power dynamics in that kind of information gathering, and that's where you can do things. You can audit the data. You can try and have objective and independent evaluation. You can do various sorts of things, but the project level data typically does rely to a very considerable extent on the organisation that's doing the delivery. So that's where I think it is incredibly important for everyone to be involved at the start and to agree on how that data is going to be put together and how it's going to be monitored and what's going to happen if you are unable to collect that data as well. So what happens if there's failure? What happens if the particular data points aren't possible? Well, you just can't collect in the way that you intended at the design phase. I think all of those things need to, the sort of human error level of data collection really needs to be part of any system as it's designed, and isn't always. And the kind of investment that we do is too small scale. It would be very hard to do this. If you're making a kind of £20,000 loan, it becomes very difficult to say, right now we're all going to sit down together and work out exactly how we're going to do our data collection. You couldn't do that across all the loans that SIP has. But at least recognising where those power dynamics lie and what it feels like at the data collection end and what that means for data reliability, I think is really important. And I can give, so one of the examples we're looking at SIB, we're looking increasingly closely at employment data. So one of the things in the UK is that social businesses and charities are very poor employers when you actually start looking closely. Some of that is because it's very difficult for them to employ. They have short-term grants, and so projects, they employ people for projects and not for, they can't give long-term employment, long-term jobs. But what that means is that the way that they record job data is not sound. So when you start doing aggregate level analysis of wages and jobs, FTEs in annual accounts of charities, what comes out certainly of SIBS data is that lots of our grantees and investees must be employing people illegally. I don't think they are. I think that there's a huge recording problem, and I think that is just one example, and that's an example from accounts data where everyone has a legal duty to record it. And everyone should sort of more or less know what it is that they're doing. If you're talking about this kind of data, when you get into outcomes data, which is much more complex, you can imagine how much more difficult that becomes. And I just think there are all sorts of reliability questions.
Okay. Thank you. Josh, I wanted to move back to you. I know that you're partway through conducting some research on impact bonds in the UK at the moment and have been speaking to a lot of people. It would be great if you could give us a sense of the purpose of that research and flavour of your early findings.
Yeah. So, that's right. We're midway through quite a lot of interviews, which have been actually very enjoyable. And we've got some fantastic quotes. But basically, the point of this is, we're aiming to produce a report which is going to be sort of talking a little bit about the data issues, talking a little bit about general experiences of social impact bonds, and kind of providing a bit of an outside perspective. What's fascinating, though, is coming at this from a general procurement angle rather than an impact bond specific, is the similarities, which you keep seeing time and again in commissioning in general. We've just heard about the issues about, designing services to make sure that the data sort of requirements are included from the beginning. The classic example of that is from a not a impact bond perspective is the Capita British Army recruitment process, which is still going on. They were talking about £500–600 million contract. It took them 8 years before they realised what data they actually needed to be collecting to evaluate it successfully. That's a ridiculous period of time to not understand what you're actually trying to measure. And, so when we started interviewing people, across the UK, we spoke to a lot of providers. We spoke to some who were involved with the Newcastle, the Waste to Wellness SIB, and there were some fantastic quotes which came out of that. One was death by data, that link workers from this organisation were spending 60% of their time collecting the data required to fulfil the investors and the SPV's requirements. And another one was saying that there's a balance here, and it seems from our interviews it's sort of 50-50. A lot of the sort of organisations involved find that more data is good. 50% find that actually it's a bit onerous and it's actually being detrimental to their ability to deliver services. Someone else talked about the fact that there were some fantastic mathematical acrobatics going on to get the relevant sort of outcomes from the data they were provided. Someone else involved in another social impact bond, and I'm going to keep this incredibly vague, was basically admitted to gaming the system in that one of their soft outcomes, they were on both sides, from the provider and the intermediary, there were manipulations going on as to what the data was showing, because they basically didn't have enough time to actually collect the data to the standards required. So from our perspective, looking at this from a think tank who, Reform's been around for 20 odd years now, coming at this from a general commissioning perspective, impact bonds, they're not really that unique in terms of the challenges they're facing. The problem is when you start justifying something as being based upon outcomes, and then start digging under the surface and realizing that those outcomes perhaps aren't as solid as people keep telling you, that's an issue. And one of our big things is, again, the publication of data. We're not saying that everything needs to be published. That isn't our sort of stance. Our stance is, what is the sort of, what do we as the general public need to see to be able to evaluate these successfully and efficiently? And SIB shouldn't be held to a different standard from any other public service model. I think it's irresponsible to say that just because there's private capital involved, or that there's a more complex payment by results mechanism, we should be talking about these differently. I think the reality is that it is a means of delivering a public service, a means of commissioning a public service, and they should all be held to the same standard. My friends at the IFG recently, the Institute for Government, recently published a stat which was only 30% of all procurement contracts are published on Contracts Finder, which technically they should all be published on. So 30% isn't a great statistic. So this problem is, it's endemic across the public sector. Social impact bonds aren't unique in that perspective, but it's very easy to look at them because they're relatively more transparent than other types of funding and say, well, why aren't you publishing more? You've got this data, you say you're outcomes focused, why aren't you publishing the rest of it? And I mean, ideally, that would be fantastic if it was all out there, but the reality is that it's not, I don't think, where we should be aiming. We should be aiming for what do we need to be able to judge these effectively, really. So yeah, our interviews have been incredibly interesting in that regard. A final little anecdote, actually, which came out of an interview the other day, was someone was talking about an investor being involved. So this social impact bond, I think, had an SPV, an investor, an intermediary, a technical assistance provider, and 4 or 5 sort of, grant funders. And this provider, who was involved for quite a while, basically said that they felt throughout the entire process, one organisation would be requesting certain data, so they'd provide it. And then next thing you know, the other one would be requesting something different, so they'd have to take this Excel sheet and change it around and give it to them. And then the third one wants something different, so they have to do that. And before you know it, it's Monday. Someone spent their whole weekend trying to do this. They get back into work and realise, actually, we need to collect more data because it's due again in 5 days, And so it's kind of, how do you find this balance between evaluating something effectively, but also allowing people just to deliver the service they're being contracted to do? So that's I guess the reform sort of angle. I hope you'll all keep an eye out for the report when we publish it, because it's going to have some more interesting tidbits in it.
Thanks, Josh. I think that point around the burdensome nature of data collection links back to some of the conversation possibly yesterday. Jen, we had quite a contrary discussion in a panel yesterday afternoon where we were thinking about the issue of complexity, and complex systems was raised throughout the session. And I've got some great quotes from Twitter, thanks to David Floyd, whose fingers fly at the speed of light. And I think most of these quotes were from Adrian Brown. And he said, you can't use reductive logic on a complex system. Outcomes are emergent properties of a complex system. And you can't take a cat apart and fully understand it for its cattiness, or words to that effect. But should we give up on outcomes?
No, is my simple answer to that question. I think there's a set of kind of problems with how complexity is being used within certainly the English, the UK social sector, as a means of I think understandably trying to unpick some of the problems that we've talked about. It's a way of saying there's there's all sorts of poor incentives in the systems that we're setting up. We're encouraging people to game stuff. We're encouraging them to spend time away from the front line. These are all bad things that we don't want. To move, and I can understand the criticism of that. I can understand the pushback to that because I felt that myself, but I think you see it in the aggregate. I think from that to say, it's all so complex and so impossible to define and understand and predict, and therefore there's no such thing as a reasonable measurement, I think is taking it too far in the other direction. Most complexity theorists wouldn't actually maintain that, I don't think. I mean, the ones I'm most familiar with are the abstruse French ones like Deleuze, who doesn't say that at all. I mean, he's fine with linear causality, so totally sort of straightforward causality is within his theory. But it typically moves towards probabilistic, statistical versions of causality, which I think is fine when we're talking about relatively complex interventions. I don't think there's any problem in thinking probabilistically and in assessing an outcome in a statistically probabilistic way. You don't have to have one for one. You don't have to have an expectation that every single thing is going to work. So that's kind of one part of it. The other is that the idea of interdependence is not new. We've been doing things in social programs, understanding the interdependence of things and people and behaviors and systems for a very, very long time. Social work is based on the idea of interdependence. So I don't think it even is necessarily a new idea. I think it's come back with an interesting sort of new force, but isn't necessarily, it's sort of picking apart something that already exists. And then I suppose my third point about it is around measurement, and I think there is a naive perception or understanding of measurement that comes through that critique. Which is that measurement is necessarily perfectionist, that any use of measurement is trying to find some sort of objective thing that stands outside of delivery. And I don't think that is most people's experience of social program delivery. The experience of a good measure is that it's representational. It plays a part in the kind of delivery that you do. It helps you to understand how you are doing your work. It helps people who you are supporting through your program to understand what they're doing. And that kind of representational measure, that's also been around a very long time in very long-standing social programs. The example that I like to use, because it is well established and everyone's familiar with it, is the example of Alcoholics Anonymous, which has been around since the 1930s and has many of the features that are being extolled at the moment as the best way of running social programs. So it's a bottom-up social movement. It's self-organizing. It's run by people who have lived experience. So alcoholics support other alcoholics. It's a very adaptive kind of process, but it also has lots of fairly traditional elements to it. So it's a structured program. It has 12 steps. It's a program that looks at certain sorts of outcomes. There is an expectation that people remain sober. There's a clear outcome as part of that. And there's also a very clear measure. And the measure that they use in AA is numbers of days of sobriety. So you go up to the front of the room and you say how many days you've been sober. And that is both an outcome, and it's something that the AA could measure and they could talk to investors about, but it's also something that works for the people who are being supported by the AA. They understand their own journey and themselves and their own experience of alcoholism through that measure. And so it is possible to do both of those things. There are examples out there that do it really, really successfully. It's just that abstracting all of that into just a spreadsheet gets away from the living experience of good measurement. And good measurement is really important. And it's not weird and abstruse and strange. It is a daily part of our lives.
Please do.
Yeah. So, Josh, I mean, you've mentioned that death by data, and you also elaborated on the burden. Isn't that a matter of scale? Because, I mean, if I look at the social impact bond, which, to be quite honest, from my point of view, does not make any economic sense, with 5 investors and 3 providers, and the amount might be in the 100,000 area, and there is one guy to deliver, and this guy does nothing else but collecting data all day long. That doesn't make sense. But if that is an intervention which will be funded in a double-digit million area, and there are more than this one guy, and there's might be out of these 100 responsible for the intervention, one person responsible for the data collection, then we have a completely different picture in terms of economies of scale, isn't it?
I wonder whether I could package up Christian's plea for proportionality with any questions from the floor. Please feel free to ask away. Thank you.
Hi, Graham Dixon, Agencia. For a bit of my life, I ran drugs and alcohol treatment services, and I'm just looking at the NDTMS data definitions, which are over 20 pages of, and this is just one, and I'm looking at N, and there's O, P, and Q, and various other. They didn't start at A, fortunately, so it's not quite as horrific as it sounds. But what I would say is that for us as a service provider, we're really quite used to this. But the first time we took over a service, everybody said, well, you can't take over a service because you've never done this before. And I won't say quite how bad our first few returns were, so we say they were interesting, and there was lots of collaboration sorting it out. But getting people used to the data and the requirements really early, and getting other people, perhaps from other SIBs involved, to help them through that process, rather than everybody having to learn from scratch, from day one, would be a huge asset within this environment. And I think the fragmentation of commissioning and data, the data looks horrific if you've never seen it before. After a year, it was taking us minutes to provide. But it's just that initial shock and a completely different way of working that I think is a big barrier.
Okay, thank you. Any others? Oh, Tim, thank you. So.
Right. It's just an observation, really. On, I mean, I would love to have more data on how all these SIPs are working and what they deliver, and more information in order to make it easier to set a price for outcomes and all the rest of it. And I can see how, for certain types of investors, you really need that in order to be able to get involved. But I think there's also a risk that if we move too far in that direction, then we actually take away the point of doing social impact bonds in the first place, because part of the idea of it is that you're trying something that you don't really know if it's going to work, and somebody is willing to take a risk, and that is potentially problematic, I think, in this, in that we could be moving more towards a space where we only measure things that we're pretty certain. Either we know what the outcome is going to be, or we can quantify the risk in such a way that we can effectively insure against it. But you actually, I think, to make these things work in new areas and pioneer new ways of working, and working with client groups that haven't been worked before in order to deliver things that haven't been tried. You by definition don't have that. And I think that's an important aspect of what I see the role of these things to be for, is to have people who are willing to go into that situation knowing that, potentially they might lose some money.
Thank you. Rory.
I've got a comment, and it relates to Carillion, which was a large government contractor that collapsed and caused the loss of jobs, and it was a very difficult time. But the government didn't know what contracts Carillion had in any sort of way that they could sort of use to respond to effectively. And I don't think the UK is a good sort of leader on this, and this is an international, interdisciplinary team, and I think we as a community need to decide, do we want to be a data collaborative? And, what does that mean? Do we as a community need to start sharing sort of data definitions? Do we need to start sort of asking, well, how do we want to use the data, and get smarter and more granular about this, in this conversation? And I think that it has to be an informed sort of decision to be a data sharing community, rather than it being sort of about fixing information asymmetry, which could be like just between the parties, like let's just share some information. And so I guess my question at the end of that long comment, and thank you for your patience. The question at the end of that long comment is, are you more excited about being sort of transparent within the parties, or are you more excited about more transparency amongst the community members?
Great, thank you. Can we take one more question and then I'll pass along for responses and wrap up? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sylvia. I come from Portugal Social Innovation. I'm not going to make a question, but one observation, because we created, just to give an example, the Portuguese government implemented a platform, public information, on its onevalue.gov.pt, where the government started to publish the unitary costs on social investment. The government is saying, I'm spending this kind of money with prisoners. I'm spending this kind of money in education. I'm spending this kind of money in different areas, 5 different areas yet, justice, education, social welfare, employment. And we are trying to, so this is the money we spend on solving social problems. This is a start of conversation to the private sector and to the organizations in the field, because it's a changing of mindset, because the government says, this is what I'm spending. So as an organization, if you want to develop a project that prevents this problem, maybe this is the kind of value that you can settle for being efficient. That's the kind of money I'm willing to spend as government to prevent this problem. This is a beginning of conversation. It's not complete, this platform. Different areas of the government are more willing to develop more unitary costs than others, but we are pushing it and making it very transparent. Another platform the government Portuguese has, it's like all the public procurement are online. The value, the contractor, every entity of the government has to publish within 4 weeks after the contract is done, the value and the entity that was contract for every public procurement. So that's another efficient and a way of building transparency to the citizens and all organizations.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'd like to pass back along the panel, if that's okay, responding to those questions and offering us a few closing remarks. I wonder if you might put a kind of reasons to be cheerful spin on things as well. Thanks, Christian. Or Maya, would you like to kick us off?
So maybe just, that sounds amazing. In the international development context, that kind of information is not available, unfortunately. So yes, sounds like a beautiful solution. Definitely nowhere near that kind of level of data that is out there. But to respond to Rory's questions around what are we excited about sharing amongst ourselves or sharing more broadly, I think maybe I'll go back to a survey that was done amongst impact bond working group members, and it's basically a group of mostly donor agencies that are interested in the potential of impact bonds and outcomes-based funding. And the question that we asked is, what are some of the key barriers to scaling up impact bonds? And the answers were lack of understanding, lack of evidence, and too complex, too time-consuming. And to me, at least one way to address those key barriers is to have a knowledge hub for impact bonds, where you're looking at, toolboxes, frequently asked questions, sharings of best practices, research on what works and what doesn't, and starting to build the community of practice. It's a start. I know that in the UK, obviously, the Go Lab has done that quite a bit, and we're also supporting the Go Lab with DFID's help to put that out there on the international space, so that not each individual stakeholder reinvents the wheel and has its own little pilot, to your point, that does not help with economies of scale. And as impact bonds move from this startup phase to maybe more mature, thinking about, is there a certain standards and processes that would require certain sharing of information?
Great. Thanks. Christian, any more closing remarks?
No, I find that super interesting. Would be interested to look at this. Are we excited about the data sharing? First of all, we just need it. Yeah. so we don't think about whether we are excited or not. Yeah, that's just a fact. And but with pleasure, I have to say that at least, and our impact bond is much larger, so the economies of scale might be far different from your examples. With pleasure, we think that the ICRC also is pleased with that way of monitoring, because it just provides more insight on the efficiency of their intervention.
Thanks. Josh?
So just in response to that, I mean, the UK, you are legally supposed to publish the contracts on Contracts Finder within a certain period of time, which includes all that information. The problem is people just don't do it. So that's, you know, it's good intention. I'd be interested to see the statistics of how many people actually do, you know, publish, because in the UK, I'd say it's about 30%, which isn't very good. Regarding the, like, I think I can hopefully answer a couple of these points, like, in one. Might be a bit optimistic, but I think this idea of, you know, the reason we're talking about data and, like, you know, consistency and transparency and stuff is, you know, it doesn't just kill one bird. It helps with the data sharing points. You know, if you can learn from other people's good practices and bad experiences, you know, then it makes the whole process easier. If there's consistent standards, you know, if there's a general level of, you know, this is what we're talking about, this is what we need to do, this is how we need to report it, where we should publish it, and so on, then, you know, yeah, that is fantastic, because that helps with the accountability issues, that helps with the evaluations, that helps with the learning from each other. You know, I think the proportionality sort of thing, you know, this idea of, you know, again, if we're more transparent and more open about it, then if you're a team of 4 working on a social impact bond, you can look at what other teams of 4 have done and learn from them and say, well, they really struggled with data, so we're going to have to factor that in, you know, and so on. So I think this is all a big, you know, kind of point where it all comes down to we just need to be much more considerate around the data requirements. Like Jen said, from a very early stage in the process, you know, from as soon as you start thinking about what are we going to try and achieve with this, you know, you have to start considering the data side of it. And optimistically, you know, we did help contribute to the GoLabs database, so, you know, I'm not going to say it's amazing, but it is amazing. But, you know, we found in that process that there are huge gaps in what is publicly available, and that information may be there, you know, it may be out there and we just didn't Google search hard enough. But the point is that, you know, if we're doing this full time trying to find this information, how's a commissioner who is doing this and juggling 20 other procurement tasks at the same time supposed to find anything? So, yeah, you know, we need to just make sure it's more brought together, more easily accessible, and, yeah, consistent, I guess.
Thanks. And over to you, Jen.
Yes, so I think we should be thinking about the kind of an ecosystem of data sharing. I think there's a few kind of really significant problems. One is that data analysis is just hugely under-resourced across the whole social sector. So it's even having the one person who can start doing the work is not always the case. And that even if, so that would be one thing, so we'd have to grow the sector's ability to be able to do this work, to have the right kinds of people with the right sets of skills. Typically, data analysts can secure pretty decent salaries in the private sector. It becomes harder to encourage them to come and work in the social sector where they might make less money. And there's also, a separate to that, which is a kind of resource issue, there's also a data literacy problem. So aside from having expert people who can do the nitty-gritty of the work and fill in the spreadsheets, there's a broader problem with how we function and think about data and use data and learn from data and circulate kind of information insights. ICRC is actually a really interesting example of an organisation that's worked very, very hard on data literacy internally, and they've been doing that for a number of years with an officer who is in charge of data literacy internally. But they have the resource to do that, and even in that case, that's a massive organisation with one person who's doing that job. So if you think about the sector as a whole, that's a big task and a big ask, and I'm not sure where the money comes from to invest in that, given all the problems about overheads that already exist. More optimistically, I would say that there is growing enthusiasm for that and a growing recognition that we do need to start making that change. I think there are growing examples too of data organisations that are working to make information more available, more transparent, more shareable. So 360 giving, open ops are kind of good examples of that. Just to sell something I'm working on as well. I have a project called the Social Economy Data Lab, and that's developed a standard for social investment, and it's a pretty large standard. It's open. It's a spec that anyone could use. At the moment, we have 3 organisations publishing into that spec, but we are actively seeking other people who would be interested in using it. It's very adaptable. You can use it in your own way as long as you are willing to do some publication. So I think there are a growing number of initiatives that are trying to do some of that work of data transparency as part of the growing part of shifting towards a different kind of approach towards data that actually values everyone's participation and isn't top-down and isn't just inevitably the powerful telling the less powerful what to do, because there's more informed voices at every level of the chain, which is, I think, what's really, really important. Until we have informed, confident voices all the way through the social sector, it is difficult for that to be a fair exchange. So that's something that we really need to do. But I do think there's a shift. I see a shift. So I think it will change and get better.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for joining us in this session, and a stimulating conversation on data feels like a rabbit out of a hat, so I'm very glad for that. We're doing quite a quick turnaround between the next plenary session and this one, so I would just like to say thank you to our fabulous panellists. Thanks.